It was a chaotic evening at Riverview General Hospital. The ER buzzed with a cacophony of voices, doctors shouting orders, patients groaning in pain, and the constant beeping of monitors. Among the crowd sat Dr. Eleanor Foster, clutching her abdomen as beads of sweat formed on her forehead. She was dressed simply, an oversized cardigan, jeans, and sneakers, hardly the attire one would expect of someone in her position. Her dark skin glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, her expression a mix of pain and determination. To anyone observing, she looked like just another patient waiting for help, and that's exactly what she intended. Eleanor had come to the hospital without her usual entourage of assistants or her commanding presence that typically preceded her in boardrooms. Tonight, she wanted to see firsthand what the community she served experienced in moments of vulnerability. She had often heard whispers of unequal treatment, of patients dismissed or ignored based on their appearance. But those were just stories, right? Surely not in her hospital. She had to see for herself. However, she hadn't anticipated how painfully real the experience would be. As the minutes dragged on, her discomfort grew. Eleanor approached the front desk and politely informed the triage nurse, a young woman with a frazzled demeanor, that her pain was worsening. "Please, I think something's seriously wrong," Eleanor said, wincing as she spoke. The nurse barely looked up, her fingers tapping away at the keyboard. "We're doing the best we can, ma'am. Have a seat, and someone will call you soon." Eleanor nodded, though the response stung. She returned to her chair and tried to focus on her breathing. Across the room, a man with a bleeding arm was taken in immediately. Another woman with a visible rash was called soon after. Still, Eleanor waited. 30 more minutes passed before Dr. Mark Willis appeared, a tall, imposing figure with a sharp jawline and an air of self-importance. He glanced at the chart in his hand and then at Eleanor. "Miss Foster," he called out, his tone clipped. Eleanor raised her hand weakly, struggling to stand. "I prefer Dr. Foster," she corrected, her voice strained but firm. Dr. Willis raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "All right, Dr. Foster, what seems to be a problem today?" he asked, his tone dripping with impatience. Eleanor explained her symptoms, a severe, sharp pain in her abdomen that had worsened over the past few hours. Dr. Willis scribbled on his clipboard, barely making eye contact. "Sounds like a stomach bug," he said dismissively. "We'll get you some fluids and send you home." Eleanor blinked, taken aback. "I think it's more serious than that. Could you at least run some tests?" she asked, trying to keep her frustration in check. Dr. Willis sighed, clearly annoyed. "Look, we're slammed tonight. There's a protocol we follow. And frankly, this doesn't sound like an emergency. If it gets worse, you can come back." Eleanor's heart sank. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her pain was real, and she knew her body well enough to know something was seriously wrong. But here she was, being brushed off as though she were exaggerating or wasting time. She glanced around the room, noticing how other patients were being attended to promptly. The nurse who had earlier ignored her seemed to be smiling warmly at a man in a business suit who had just walked in. Eleanor clenched her fists, her pain momentarily overshadowed by a wave of frustration and anger. "Doctor," she said, her voice steady despite the pain, "I need you to take this seriously. I'm telling you, something is wrong." Dr. Willis smirked, an expression that felt more like a slap in the face. "And I'm telling you, it's a stomach bug. But if you insist, I can order a basic blood test. That's the best I can do right now." Eleanor stared at him, weighing her options. She could demand better treatment, but what would that achieve? More resistance, more dismissive comments. For now, she decided to let the situation play out. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, doctor," she said quietly. As Dr. Willis walked away, Eleanor's mind raced. This was more than just bad treatment. This was a systemic issue, one she had heard about from countless patients, but had never experienced herself. And now it was clear as day. She was being dismissed not because of her symptoms, but because of how she looked. Her clothes, her skin, her unassuming demeanor, they had all worked against her. The nurse returned to take Eleanor's blood sample, her attitude curt and impersonal. "It'll take a while to get the results," she said without meeting Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor nodded, watching the nurse walk away with a sinking feeling. How many others had sat in this very chair, experiencing the same indifference? How many had left the hospital untreated, their pain dismissed? Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her mind replaying every interaction she had witnessed in the hospital that night. The differences in tone, the subtle but unmistakable biases, the way some patients were treated with dignity while others were barely acknowledged. This was her hospital, her responsibility, and it was failing the very people it was meant to serve. An hour later, Dr. Willis returned with the blood test results. "Everything looks normal," he said, handing her the report as though it were a dismissal notice. "Like I said, probably just a bug. Get some rest and stay hydrated." Eleanor took the report, her expression calm, but her mind ablaze. She stood slowly, gripping the edge of the chair for support. "Thank you, doctor," she said, her voice steady. "I'll be sure to follow up on this." Dr. Willis gave her a perfunctory nod, already moving on to the next patient. As Eleanor walked out of the ER, the pain in her abdomen was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. She had come here hoping to understand the challenges her community faced, and now she understood all too well. But she wasn't leaving defeated. No, this was just the beginning. The next day, she would return to this very hospital, not as a patient but as the head of the board. And when she did, Dr. Willis and the entire staff would see her for who she truly was, not just another face in the crowd, but a force to be reckoned with. The morning sun cast a warm glow over Riverview General Hospital, but for Dr. Mark Willis, the day ahead promised anything but warmth. He had no idea that his actions from the night before were about to upend his carefully curated world. As he strode into the hospital lobby, coffee in hand and confidence radiating from his every step, the hospital staff buzzed with whispers. Something was happening, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The air felt charged, tense, and alive with anticipation. Dr. Eleanor Foster arrived shortly after, this time dressed sharply in a tailored navy blue suit. Her posture was upright, her expression calm, but her eyes carried a steely determination. The events of the previous night were etched deeply into her mind, fueling her resolve. She had spent the night not just reflecting but planning. Today wasn't about retaliation. It was about accountability and change. Eleanor walked through the hospital's main doors, the sound of her heels echoing in the lobby. Heads turned as staff members recognized her, their whispers growing louder. "Isn't that Dr. Foster? What's she doing here? She looks different." The casual familiarity from the night before had vanished. Now, Eleanor commanded the room with an effortless authority that left no doubt about who she was. She headed straight for the administrative wing, bypassing the ER entirely. Her assistant, Carol, who had been alerted early that morning, was already waiting with a stack of files. "Good morning, Dr. Foster," Carol greeted her, a knowing smile on her face. "I've compiled the reports you requested. They're ready in the boardroom." "Thank you, Carol," Eleanor replied, her tone professional but warm. "Let's make sure everyone is present for the meeting. I want the full board, department heads, and Dr. Willis in attendance." Carol hesitated for a moment. "Dr. Willis, should I let him know it's mandatory?" Eleanor's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "Oh, he'll know." Meanwhile, in the ER, Dr. Willis continued his morning rounds, oblivious to the storm brewing above. He had just finished suturing a patient's arm when a young nurse approached him, her face pale. "Dr. Willis, you've been requested in the boardroom," she said nervously. "Right away." He frowned, irritation flickering across his face. "Now, I'm in the middle of rounds. Can't it wait?" The nurse shook her head, her voice lowering to a whisper. It's Dr. Foster's orders. The mention of Eleanor's name sent a chill down his spine. He hadn't thought about her since dismissing her concerns the previous night, brushing off the encounter as just another tedious patient interaction. But now, hearing her name again, a strange unease settled in his chest. Still, he shrugged it off and made his way upstairs, his usual air of confidence slightly subdued. When Dr. Willis entered the boardroom, he was greeted by a scene unlike any he had experienced before. The long, polished table was filled with board members, department heads, and senior staff, their faces serious. At the head of the table sat Dr. Foster, her calm demeanor masking the intensity that burned beneath the surface. Her eyes locked onto Dr. Willis the moment he walked in, and for a brief second, he felt as though he had been stripped bare, every flaw and fault exposed. "Dr. Willis," Eleanor said, her voice smooth but firm. "Thank you for joining us. Please, have a seat." He hesitated, glancing around the room. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Reluctantly, he took the empty chair nearest to Eleanor, his unease growing by the second. The meeting began with Eleanor addressing the room. She spoke with precision, outlining the hospital's mission to provide equitable and compassionate care to every patient. Her words were carefully chosen, weaving a narrative that highlighted the hospital's strengths while subtly pointing out its flaws. It wasn't until halfway through her address that she turned her attention directly to Dr. Willis. "Last night," Eleanor began, her tone measured, "I visited this hospital as a patient. I came seeking help for a severe medical issue, one that could have escalated into something much worse without proper attention. Unfortunately, my experience was far from what I would expect from an institution of this caliber." The room fell silent. All eyes were on Eleanor, except for Dr. Willis, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth to respond, but Eleanor held up a hand, silencing him. "You'll have your chance to speak, Dr. Willis. Please allow me to finish." She went on to recount her experience in painstaking detail, sparing no moment, no comment, and no gesture. She described the dismissive attitude of the trade staff, the condescension in Dr. Willis's tone, and the lack of urgency despite her clear symptoms. As she spoke, the tension in the room grew palpable. Some of the board members exchanged uneasy glances, while others fixed their gaze on Dr. Willis, their expressions ranging from disappointment to barely concealed anger. Eleanor paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "What I experienced was not just poor judgment," she continued, her voice growing firmer, "but a systemic failure. And I suspect that my case is not an isolated one. This hospital, under our leadership, has fostered an environment where certain patients, based on their appearance, their background, or their perceived social status, are treated as less deserving of care. That is unacceptable." Dr. Willis finally found his voice. "Dr. Foster, with all due respect, I was following protocol. The ER was extremely busy last night, and we have to prioritize cases based on severity." "Severity?" Eleanor interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. "Tell me, Dr. Willis, how do you assess severity without listening to the patient, without running the necessary tests, without even looking them in the eye?" He faltered, his confidence unraveling under her scrutiny. I made a judgment call, based on the information I had, based on assumptions," Eleanor corrected, her gaze unwavering. "Assumptions that nearly cost me my health. And if I were not in the position I am today, I would have left this hospital feeling humiliated, dismissed, and unheard." The room was silent again, the gravity of Eleanor's words hanging heavy in the air. She turned to the board members. "This is not about singling out one individual. This is about addressing a culture that allows such behavior to persist. Effective immediately, I am initiating a full review of our practices, including implicit bias training for all staff and a comprehensive audit of patient care records to identify patterns of neglect or inequity." The board members nodded, their expressions serious. Dr. Willis, however, looked pale. "Dr. Foster, I didn't mean to. I'm not interested in excuses, Dr. Willis, Eleanor said, cutting him off. I'm interested in solutions. You'll have the opportunity to contribute to those solutions, should you choose to remain a part of this institution. But understand this. Things will change, starting today. As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor rose from her seat, her presence commanding the room. She exchanged brief words with several board members before turning to leave. Dr. Willis remained seated, his mind racing. For the first time in his career, he felt truly vulnerable, his authority and reputation hanging by a thread. As Eleanor stepped out of the boardroom, she took a deep breath. The first step had been taken, but the journey ahead would be long and challenging. Still, she felt a sense of resolve. This was more than just a personal victory. It was a turning point for the hospital and the community it served. And Eleanor Foster was ready to lead the charge. The day after the board meeting, the hospital was abuzz with speculation. Word of Dr. Eleanor Foster's unexpected undercover visit and the revelations that followed had spread like wildfire. Staff whispered in hallways, patients overheard fragments of conversations, and even the cafeteria was alive with chatter about what would happen next. In the midst of this chaos, Dr. Mark Willis found himself the reluctant center of attention. Dr. Willis spent most of the morning avoiding direct eye contact with his colleagues. He could feel their judgment, their silent assessments of his actions. Every whispered conversation seemed to stop as he walked by, replaced by awkward silences or forced pleasantries. The normally confident and self-assured doctor now felt like an outsider in the very place he had worked for years. By mid-morning, he was called to Eleanor's office for a one-on-one meeting. The walk to her office felt like an eternity, each step weighed down by a mix of dread and defiance. When he arrived, her assistant, Carol, greeted him with a polite but firm tone. "Dr. Foster will see you now," she said, gesturing toward the heavy wooden door. Dr. Willis took a deep breath before stepping inside. Eleanor sat behind her desk, a stack of files neatly arranged in front of her. Unlike the boardroom meeting, where she had addressed a group, this was a more intimate setting. Yet somehow the atmosphere was even more intimidating. She didn't immediately look up, instead finishing a note she was writing. When she finally met his gaze, her expression was calm but resolute. "Dr. Willis," she began, gesturing for him to sit. He obeyed, though every fiber of his being wanted to remain standing, to assert some semblance of control. "Thank you for coming." He nodded, his mouth dry. "Of course." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving his. "I want to start by acknowledging something," she said. "You're an excellent physician. Your track record with surgeries and patient outcomes is impressive. That's why, up until now, I've had no reason to question your commitment to this hospital or its mission." Dr. Willis felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this meeting wasn't going to be as bad as he feared. "Thank you, Dr. Foster. That means a lot coming from you." "But," she continued, her tone sharpening, "yesterday's events have forced me to reevaluate what that commitment truly means." The flicker of hope extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Dr. Foster, if I may." "You may not." Eleanor interrupted, her voice firm but controlled. "Not yet. I need you to listen." Her words cut through him like a scalpel, precise and unyielding. He nodded, swallowing his protest. "I've reviewed your file," she said, tapping the stack of papers in front of her. "And while your medical skills are exemplary, there's a pattern in the feedback from patients and staff alike. A pattern of dismissiveness, particularly toward those who don't fit a certain profile. Would you like to explain that?" Dr. Willis hesitated. He had always prided himself on being efficient, on cutting through the noise to get to the root of the problem. But he had never stopped to consider how his approach might be perceived by others. I'm not sure what you mean," he said cautiously. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Then let me be clear. Patients of color, patients from lower income backgrounds, patients who don't present as textbook cases, These are the individuals who consistently report feeling dismissed or undervalued under your care. Do you understand the gravity of that?" He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The truth was, he hadn't noticed. Or maybe he had, but he had justified it to himself as simply being efficient, as prioritizing the cases that seemed most urgent. Now, faced with Eleanor's scrutiny, those justifications felt hollow. I never intended to treat anyone unfairly," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I've made mistakes, I'm willing to learn from them." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. "Intentions are irrelevant, Dr. Willis. What matters are the outcomes. And the outcome of your actions, or inactions, last night was a failure to provide adequate care to a patient in need. Do you understand that?" He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "Yes," he said quietly. "Good," Eleanor said, leaning back in her chair, "because this isn't just about you. It's about this hospital and the culture we've allowed to flourish here. A culture where implicit biases go unchecked, where some patients are seen as less deserving of care. That ends now." Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Dr. Willis felt a pang of guilt, not just for his actions, but for the system he had unknowingly perpetuated. He had always seen himself as a healer, someone who made a difference. But now he realized that he had been blind to the ways in which he had failed to live up to that ideal. "I want to help," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. "I want to be part of the solution." Eleanor's expression softened, just slightly. "That's good to hear," she said, "because I have a proposal for you." He frowned, unsure of what to expect. "A proposal?" "Yes," she said. "Effective immediately, you'll be reassigned from your current duties. Instead, you'll be leading the hospital's new Equity in Care initiative. Your role will be to identify and address the biases in our system, to ensure that every patient who walks through these doors receives the care they deserve. It won't be easy, and it won't be comfortable, but it's necessary." Dr. Willis's first instinct was to push back. He wasn't a diversity expert or a policymaker. He was a surgeon. But as he looked into Eleanor's eyes, he realized that this was more than a punishment. It was an opportunity, a chance to redeem himself and make a real difference. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady. "Whatever it takes." Eleanor nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Good. Then let's get to work." As Dr. Willis left her office, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, determination, and a lingering sense of unease. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. Eleanor watched him go, her expression thoughtful. She knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but she was determined to see it through. For herself, for the hospital, and for the community they served. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The boardroom at Riverview General Hospital had never been as crowded as it was on this particular morning. Every seat at the long oak table was filled, and an additional row of chairs had been brought in to accommodate department heads, senior staff, and key administrative personnel. Even the standing room along the walls was packed with curious onlookers. The tension in the air was thick, an almost tangible presence that made everyone speak in hushed tones as they waited for the meeting to begin. Dr. Eleanor Foster entered the room with a presence that commanded silence. Gone was the patient who had been dismissed in the ER just days before. Today, she was every inch the formidable leader who had built her reputation on integrity, intelligence, and compassion. Her tailored suit and poised demeanor only accentuated the air of authority she carried. Behind her trailed Carol, her assistant, carrying a stack of files so tall it seemed almost comical, until everyone remembered that each of those files likely represented a grievance or an oversight that Eleanor was about to lay bare. Eleanor took her place at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping the room. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her to speak. But instead of starting with words, she began by gesturing to Carol, who handed her a thick binder. Eleanor flipped it open and pulled out a single piece of paper, holding it aloft for the room to see. "This," she began, her voice even but carrying an undeniable edge, "is a summary of patient complaints filed at Riverview General over the past 3 years. Complaints that were either dismissed outright or resolved with no substantive changes. Complaints that, if we're honest, paint a very troubling picture." She placed the paper on the table and slid it toward the board president, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "These are not isolated incidents," Eleanor continued. "They are part of a pattern, one that suggests our hospital is failing in its most fundamental mission, to provide equitable and compassionate care to everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Dr. Mark Willis, seated near the middle of the table, felt his stomach twist. He hadn't seen this coming, not the scale of it, nor the precision with which Eleanor was addressing the issue. She wasn't just calling out individual failures, she was exposing the systemic problem. Eleanor's tone remained measured, but her words carried an undeniable force. "During my time as head of this board, I have worked tirelessly to ensure that Riverview General is a place of healing, a place where people feel safe. But my experience as a patient just days ago proved to me that we are far from where we need to be. And if I hadn't been who I am, if I didn't have the privilege of my position, I would have left here feeling invisible, dismissed, and deeply hurt." She paused, letting the gravity of her statement sink in. Around the table, people shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down at their notes, avoiding her gaze, while others glanced at Dr. Willis, who sat rigidly in his chair, his face a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. Eleanor reached for another document from the stack. "I asked for a comprehensive review of patient care records from the past year," she said. "What we found was troubling. Patients from marginalized communities, particularly people of color, were significantly more likely to receive delayed care, have their symptoms dismissed, or be subjected to unnecessary scrutiny compared to their white counterparts. These are not statistics we can ignore." Her words were a punch to the gut. The room felt as if the air had been sucked out of it. Dr. Willis clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on being a skilled doctor, but now he was confronted with the reality that his actions, or inactions, were part of a much larger issue. Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering. "This is not just about numbers. This is about people, real people, who came to us in moments of vulnerability and left feeling worse than when they arrived. And that is unacceptable." She turned her gaze to Dr. Willis, her eyes piercing. "Dr. Willis, as one of our senior physicians, your conduct sets the tone for those who work under you. Your decisions, your attitude, your treatment of patients, it all matters. What happened in the ER the other night wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a reflection of a culture that we as leaders have allowed to persist." Dr. Willis opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor raised a hand to stop him. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," she said, her tone softening just slightly. "I'm here to fix what's broken. And that starts with acknowledging our failures." She gestured to Carol, who distributed a packet of documents to everyone in the room. "These are the initial recommendations for addressing the issues we've identified," Eleanor explained. "They include mandatory bias training for all staff, a new patient advocacy program, and a review process for handling complaints. Additionally, we will be forming a task force to ensure that these changes are implemented effectively." She paused, letting the significance of her words sink in. "This task force will be led by Dr. Willis," she announced, her eyes locking onto his. The room erupted into a flurry of whispers. Dr. Willis's head shot up, his face a mask of surprise and confusion. "Me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you," Eleanor said firmly. "You have the skills, the experience, and now, the perspective needed to lead this effort. I believe that you can use this opportunity to make a real difference, not just for this hospital, but for the community we serve." Dr. Willis felt a mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and a lingering sense of unease. He had expected punishment, perhaps even termination. Instead, he was being given a chance to redeem himself, to turn his mistakes into something meaningful. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression softening. "This is not going to be easy," she said. "You will face resistance. You will make mistakes. But I believe in your ability to rise to the challenge." "Do you?" Dr. Willis nodded slowly, his voice steady as he replied, "Yes, I do." Eleanor smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her otherwise serious demeanor. "Good. Then let's get to work." As Dr. Willis left her office, he felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, determination, and a lingering sense of unease. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. Eleanor watched him go, her expression thoughtful. She knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but she was determined to see it through. For herself, for the hospital, and for the community they served. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The boardroom at Riverview General Hospital had never been as crowded as it was on this particular morning. Every seat at the long oak table was filled, and an additional row of chairs had been brought in to accommodate department heads, senior staff, and key administrative personnel. Even the standing room along the walls was packed with curious onlookers. The tension in the air was thick, an almost tangible presence that made everyone speak in hushed tones as they waited for the meeting to begin. Dr. Eleanor Foster entered the room with a presence that commanded silence. Gone was the patient who had been dismissed in the ER just days before. Today, she was every inch the formidable leader who had built her reputation on integrity, intelligence, and compassion. Her tailored suit and poised demeanor only accentuated the air of authority she carried. Behind her trailed Carol, her assistant, carrying a stack of files so tall it seemed almost comical, until everyone remembered that each of those files likely represented a grievance or an oversight that Eleanor was about to lay bare. Eleanor took her place at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping the room. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her to speak. But instead of starting with words, she began by gesturing to Carol, who handed her a thick binder. Eleanor flipped it open and pulled out a single piece of paper, holding it aloft for the room to see. "This," she began, her voice even but carrying an undeniable edge, "is a summary of patient complaints filed at Riverview General over the past 3 years. Complaints that were either dismissed outright or resolved with no substantive changes. Complaints that, if we're honest, paint a very troubling picture." She placed the paper on the table and slid it toward the board president, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "These are not isolated incidents," Eleanor continued. "They are part of a pattern, one that suggests our hospital is failing in its most fundamental mission, to provide equitable and compassionate care to everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from." The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Dr. Mark Willis, seated near the middle of the table, felt his stomach twist. He hadn't seen this coming, not the scale of it, nor the precision with which Eleanor was addressing the issue. She wasn't just calling out individual failures, she was exposing the systemic problem. Eleanor's tone remained measured, but her words carried an undeniable force. "During my time as head of this board, I have worked tirelessly to ensure that Riverview General is a place of healing, a place where people feel safe. But my experience as a patient just days ago proved to me that we are far from where we need to be. And if I hadn't been who I am, if I didn't have the privilege of my position, I would have left here feeling invisible, dismissed, and deeply hurt." She paused, letting the gravity of her statement sink in. Around the table, people shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down at their notes, avoiding her gaze, while others glanced at Dr. Willis, who sat rigidly in his chair, his face a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. Eleanor reached for another document from the stack. "I asked for a comprehensive review of patient care records from the past year," she said. What we found was troubling. Patients from marginalized communities, particularly people of color, were significantly more likely to receive delayed care, have their symptoms dismissed, or be subjected to unnecessary scrutiny compared to their white counterparts. These are not statistics we can ignore. Her words were a punch to the gut. The room felt as if the air had been sucked out of it. Dr. Willis clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on being a skilled doctor, but now he was confronted with the reality that his actions or inactions were part of a much larger issue. Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering. This is not just about numbers. This is about people, real people, who came to us in moments of vulnerability and left feeling worse than when they arrived. And that is unacceptable. She turned her gaze to Dr. Willis, her eyes piercing. Dr. Willis, as one of our senior physicians, your conduct sets the tone for those who work under you. Your decisions, your attitude, your treatment of patients, it all matters. What happened in the ER the other night wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a reflection of a culture that we, as leaders, have allowed to persist. Dr. Willis opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor raised a hand to stop him. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, she said, her tone softening just slightly. I'm here to fix what's broken. And that starts with acknowledging our failures. She gestured to Carol, who distributed a packet of documents to everyone in the room. These are the initial recommendations for addressing the issues we've identified, Eleanor explained. They include mandatory bias training for all staff, a new patient advocacy program, and a review process for handling complaints. Additionally, we will be forming a task force to ensure that these changes are implemented effectively. She paused, letting the significance of her words sink in. This task force will be led by Dr. Willis, she announced, her eyes locking onto his. The room erupted into a flurry of whispers. Dr. Willis's head shot up, his face a mask of surprise and confusion. Me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, you, Eleanor said firmly. You have the skills, the experience, and now the perspective needed to lead this effort. I believe that you can use this opportunity to make a real difference, not just for this hospital, but for the community we serve. Dr. Willis felt a mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a lingering sense of unease. He had expected punishment, perhaps even termination. Instead, he was being given a chance to redeem himself, to turn his mistakes into something meaningful. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression softening. This is not going to be easy, she said. You will face resistance. You will make mistakes. But I believe in your ability to rise to the challenge. Do you? Dr. Willis nodded slowly, his voice steady as he replied, Yes, I do. Eleanor smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her otherwise serious demeanor. Good. Then let's get to work. As the meeting adjourned, the atmosphere in the room shifted. There was still tension, still uncertainty, but there was also a sense of hope. Eleanor's leadership had set a new tone, one that demanded accountability, but also offered the chance for growth and change. Dr. Willis left the boardroom feeling a strange sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was truly making a difference. And as Eleanor watched him go, she knew that this was just the beginning. Together, they would rebuild the hospital into the place it was always meant to be, a haven for healing, dignity, and compassion. In the days following the monumental board meeting, Riverview General Hospital became a microcosm of transformation and tension. The news of Dr. Eleanor Foster's undercover experience and her bold confrontation with systemic issues spread far beyond the hospital walls. Local media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a powerful tale of accountability and reform. Headlines like "Hospital Head Exposes Bias in Her Own Institution" and "A CEO's Wake-Up Call Sparks Change" dominated the front pages of newspapers and social media feeds. The spotlight was both a blessing and a curse for the hospital, illuminating its flaws while showcasing its commitment to addressing them. For the staff, the fallout was immediate and polarizing. Many employees were inspired by Eleanor's leadership and the steps she was taking to ensure fairness and equity in patient care. Nurses, in particular, felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had long been the silent witnesses to subtle acts of bias, patients being overlooked, assumptions being made, but had felt powerless to intervene. Now, they saw an opportunity to be part of a meaningful change. However, not everyone was on board. Some doctors and administrators bristled at the new protocols and mandatory training sessions, viewing them as unnecessary or even insulting. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, one senior physician grumbled to a colleague. "I don't need a lecture on how to treat patients." Others worried about the increased scrutiny, fearing that their every decision would now be second-guessed. Dr. Mark Willis found himself caught in the eye of the storm. His appointment as the leader of the hospital's new Equity in Care initiative was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a chance for him to atone for his mistakes and use his influence to drive change. Others viewed it as a form of punishment, a public acknowledgement of his failures. For Dr. Willis, it was both. The first few days in his new role were grueling. He was tasked with reviewing patient care records, identifying patterns of bias, and developing a comprehensive plan to address them. The workload was immense, but the emotional toll was even greater. As he pored over the data, he was confronted with the stark reality of how pervasive the problem was. It wasn't just him. The entire system was riddled with blind spots and implicit biases that had gone unchecked for far too long. One case, in particular, stood out to him. A young black mother who had come to the ER complaining of severe chest pain. Her symptoms had been dismissed as anxiety, and she was sent home with a prescription for a mild sedative. 2 days later, she suffered a heart attack. As Dr. Willis read the details of her case, he felt a pang of guilt that was impossible to ignore. It was a painful reminder of how high the stakes were. The community's reaction to the changes at Riverview General was equally divided. Many applauded Eleanor's transparency and her efforts to address the hospital's shortcomings. Letters of support poured in from patients, advocacy groups, and even former employees who had left the hospital due to its toxic culture. "Thank you for standing up for what's right," one letter read. "Your courage gives me hope for the future." But not all the feedback was positive. Some members of the community saw the changes as an overreaction, a form of pandering to political correctness. Why fix something that isn't broken? One comment on social media read, "The hospital has always taken great care of my family." Others accused Eleanor of using her experience as a publicity stunt, a cynical attempt to boost her own profile. Eleanor took the criticism in stride, focusing on the bigger picture. She knew that meaningful change was never easy, and resistance was inevitable. What mattered was that the hospital was finally moving in the right direction. But she also recognized that change couldn't happen in a vacuum. It required the buy-in of not just the staff but the entire community. To that end, she organized a series of community forums, inviting patients, advocates, and local leaders to share their experiences and offer suggestions for improvement. The first forum, held in the hospital's auditorium, was packed to capacity. Eleanor stood at the podium, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "I want to start by saying that I am sorry," she began. "I'm sorry for the times this hospital has failed to live up to its mission. I'm sorry for the pain and frustration that so many of you have experienced, and I'm sorry for not addressing these issues sooner." Her words were met with a mix of nods and murmurs. Some in the audience looked skeptical, their arms crossed and their expressions guarded. But others leaned forward, their faces softening as they listened. "This is not just about fixing policies or implementing new training programs," Eleanor continued. "This is about changing the way we see each other, the way we care for each other. It's about creating a culture where every patient feels seen, heard, and valued." The forum was both cathartic and eye-opening. Patients shared their stories of being ignored, dismissed, or treated unfairly. Staff members spoke candidly about the challenges they faced, from understaffing to burnout. By the end of the evening, there was a palpable sense of both urgency and hope. For Dr. Willis, the forum was a turning point. Listening to the stories of patients and their families, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. One story, in particular, struck a chord with him: a father who had brought his daughter to the ER with a high fever, only to be told he was overreacting. The girl had later been diagnosed with a severe infection that required intensive treatment. The father's voice cracked as he described the fear and helplessness he had felt that night. "I never want another family to go through what we did," the man said, his eyes glistening with tears. "Please, do better." Dr. Willis approached the man after the forum, extending a hand. "I'm sorry for what you went through," he said sincerely. "I promise we're going to do better." The man hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "I'll hold you to that," he said, his tone both hopeful and firm. The interaction stayed with Dr. Willis as he returned to his office that night. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was determined to see it through. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something that truly mattered. As the weeks turned into months, the changes at Riverview General began to take root. New protocols were implemented, staff training sessions were held, and a patient advocacy team was established to ensure that every voice was heard. The road to transformation was far from smooth, but the hospital was finally moving in the right direction. Eleanor watched the progress with a mixture of pride and humility. She knew there was still much work to be done, but she also knew that they were on the right path. And as she walked through the hospital one evening, passing by nurses, doctors, and patients, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was her hospital, her community, and together, they were building something better. Months after the whirlwind of reforms began at Riverview General Hospital, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had once been a place burdened by unspoken biases and systemic inertia was now buzzing with a sense of purpose and progress. Yet, the transformation had not come easily. The journey had been fraught with resistance, growing pains, and moments of doubt. For Eleanor Foster, the changes represented a personal and professional triumph, but she knew the work was far from over. Dr. Mark Willis stood in the newly renovated Equity and Care office, a space dedicated to fostering the hospital's commitment to fairness and dignity in patient treatment. The walls were adorned with posters showcasing stories of resilience and hope, tributes to patients who had overcome incredible odds. Among them was a portrait of a young Black mother holding her newborn, her face radiating gratitude. It was a subtle yet powerful reminder of why the work mattered. Willis was reviewing a report on the latest patient satisfaction survey results when Eleanor entered the office. She carried her signature leather portfolio and a small smile that hinted at pride and encouragement. "Mark," she said, closing the door behind her, "how are things progressing?" He looked up, setting the report aside. "Better than I expected, honestly," he admitted. "The new protocols are starting to show results. Complaints have dropped significantly, and the staff seems more engaged during the training sessions." Eleanor nodded, her smile widening. "That's good to hear, but you don't look entirely convinced." Willis hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's not that I'm not convinced. It's just, I still feel like there's so much more to do. Some of the staff are still resistant. They go through the motions, but I can tell their hearts aren't in it." Eleanor walked over to the window, gazing out at the bustling hospital courtyard below. "Change is never easy, Mark," she said, her tone thoughtful. "People cling to what they know, even when it's flawed. But the fact that we're seeing progress, real, measurable progress, means we're on the right track." She turned back to him, her eyes sharp and determined. "The question is, how do we sustain this momentum? How do we make sure this isn't just a phase, but a permanent shift in how we operate?" Willis sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking about that. We need to keep the community involved. The forums were a great start, but they can't be the only touch point. What if we created a permanent advisory council made up of patients and local leaders? They could help keep us accountable. Eleanor's face lit up with approval. Now that's the kind of thinking I like to hear. Let's make it happen. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Carol poked her head in, her expression unusually animated. "Dr. Foster, Dr. Willis, you're going to want to see this." Curious, they followed her to the hospital's main lobby, where a small crowd had gathered. At the center stood a young man in his 20s, holding a large framed photograph. As they approached, he turned to face them, his eyes brimming with emotion. "Dr. Foster, Dr. Willis," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." Eleanor and Willis exchanged puzzled glances before Eleanor spoke. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met." The young man smiled. "You wouldn't remember me, but I remember you. My mom was the patient who came in with chest pain last year, the one who almost didn't make it because no one took her seriously. She's alive today because of the changes you've made here." He held up the framed photograph, revealing an image of his mother and their family, all beaming with happiness. "This is my family," he said, "and we owe everything to you." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at the photograph. The faces staring back at her were a testament to the ripple effect of her efforts. Proof that change, no matter how difficult, could save lives and restore dignity. "Thank you for sharing this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It means more than you know." The young man nodded, his eyes glistening. "Keep going," he said. "You're making a difference." As he left, the crowd dispersed, but the impact of his words lingered. Eleanor turned to Willis, her expression a mixture of pride and resolve. "This is why we do what we do," she said quietly. "It's not about policies or protocols. It's about people." Willis nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I get it now," he said. "I really do." The months that followed saw the hospital continue to evolve. The advisory council was established, bringing a diverse range of voices into the decision-making process. Staff who had initially resisted the changes began to come around, inspired by the tangible improvements they saw in patient care and satisfaction. Even the skeptics were forced to acknowledge that something remarkable was happening. For Eleanor, the transformation was deeply personal. She often reflected on the night she had walked into the ER, just another patient in pain, and how that experience had ignited a movement. It had been humbling, eye-opening, and at times infuriating. But it had also been necessary. She had learned that true leadership wasn't about being invincible. It was about being vulnerable, about listening and adapting, and using one's power to uplift others. One evening, as the hospital quieted down, Eleanor sat in her office, gazing at the city skyline. She thought about the countless lives that had been touched by the changes they had made. But she also thought about the work that still lay ahead. The fight for equity and dignity in healthcare was far from over, and she was determined to see it through. Before leaving for the night, she wrote a note on a piece of hospital letterhead and pinned it to the bulletin board in the staff lounge. It read, "Every patient who walks through these doors deserves to be seen, heard, and cared for with compassion. Let's make sure we never forget that. Dr. Eleanor Foster." The note became a rallying cry for the staff, a daily reminder of the hospital's mission and the power of collective action. Over time, it faded and yellowed, but no one ever removed it. It was a symbol of everything Riverview General had overcome and everything it aspired to be. Eleanor's legacy wasn't just in the policies she implemented or the programs she launched. It was in the lives she touched, the culture she transformed, and the belief she instilled in others. That change, no matter how daunting, was always possible. And as the hospital continued to grow and evolve, her words remained a guiding light, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and leadership.